Okay, we're picking up where we left off with the Civil War, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Um, Probably one of my favorite of Lincoln quotes comes from an 1858 speech um, that Abraham Lincoln made at the Republican Convention, in which he quotes scripture. He says that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And most people remember that, and they don't quite remember it being a verse of scripture. They remember it more so as an Abraham Lincoln quote. But I really like what comes after it. He says, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. So this is very much a prophetic statement that he's making, that at some point something is going to have to give. So as we've already discussed in the election of 1860, that Abraham Lincoln did not receive the majority of the popular vote. However, he was able to take all of the North, which secured his presidency. Douglas submitted to Lincoln and ultimately helped his campaign. With the Northern Democrats, people are questioning where their loyalty actually resided. Is it with Southern sympathies or not? And so anyway, but at the same time, Northern Democrats did remain supportive of his administration. It was pretty obvious and pretty clear that Lincoln was not going to interfere with slavery where it already existed. And this point was reiterated in resolutions adopted by Congress that stated that the war was not waged against the established institutions of the Southern states. So Southern leaders fought the war under the dual banners of states' rights as well as preserving their particular way of life. So as the House begins to divide, we see that there are particular advantages and disadvantages for both the North and the South. The North is completely industrialized, so they have the capability of manufacturing on a very large scale basically anything that they would need for fighting a war. The industry is available, and not just the industry, but they have raw materials as well. They've got cotton, they've got steel, they've got pretty much everything that they might need that they have available to them in some shape, form, or fashion. They also have a much larger number of railroads than what the South has, so they can transport everything that they're manufacturing very quickly to their troops. But, pretty much always, if there's advantages, there's going to be disadvantages too. So, we have the disadvantages for the North. You've got a very big difficulty to maintain your supply lines if you're going to invade a large territory. If you've taken my civilization classes before, you'll probably remember this, right? The one country that you don't invade is Russia. It's just a bad idea. It's a really big country with really bad winters. So when you invade a large territory, you have got to be prepared, and you've got to make sure that your supply lines are strong and that they are guarded. The northern disadvantages, it's very difficult for them to maintain those supply lines moving into the South. Also, Southern civilians are incredibly hostile. They are not liking what's going on. They are not obliging to Union troops. This is not, completely across the South. We do have instances of groups of people who are not supportive of the Confederate cause. Even in places like Mississippi, there's a whole county really that very much was pro-Union. Also, with their disadvantages, to begin with, Northern generals were not as daring as maybe their Southern counterparts. They weren't quite as ready to take as many risks, and so that definitely becomes a disadvantage for the North. The Southerners, their advantages are few, few and far between, and their disadvantages seem to be rather great. So, looking at their advantages, their defensive strategy. So, instead of going on the offensive, they have allowed the North to invade, right? And that's an interesting word to use, allowed. Huh. I'll have to look that up. So the South has allowed the North to invade, and they are going on the defensive, which ultimately means there are fewer men needed to fight. With the peculiar institution, slavery, in existence on a large scale in the South, we have more white men who are available for service. So although there's fewer men needed, the South was ready with the men that was necessary. They also have a great number of more experienced military leaders. Several leaders from the South had participated in the Mexican-American War. They'd gone to West Point. They'd been in several different military excursions, and so they have the experience that's needed to fight a war. But also, I have this under advantages, but really we can look at this as more like a hope for an advantage. The South is expecting the British and the French to come in and help them from the outside. They're expecting outside intervention from foreign nations. Once again, another really just fantastic quote from the Civil War. William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the greatest generals in the North. Sherman is known for doing some rather cruel things, but we can see this is a letter that he wrote to someone, and this is sort of at the start of the war. He says, or he wrote, "You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out. I know I had no hand in making this war, and I know I will make more sacrifices today than any of you to secure peace." This is really intense. This is a man who understands that war is messy, it's noisy, it's chaotic, and all the order that you attempt to bring to it ultimately can fail. It can implode in a very, very short amount of time. As with most wars, there is the hope that the war will end quickly. With World War I, they said, we'll be home by Christmas. Everybody thinks that, oh, well, this is just going to be, real quick. So everyone expected a short war. When Lincoln first called for volunteers, he only required a 90-day enlistment, but after the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, the hope for a quick victory faded, and the Union implemented what's known as the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda Plan, named for the South American snake that is very, very large and is known for wrapping around its victim and crushing it. The plan was intended to slowly crush the South with a naval blockade of the Atlantic as well as the Gulf Coast. And it also included an invasion along the Cumberland, Tennessee, and Mississippi rivers to basically like slice the Confederacy in half. The defense of Washington, D.C. as well as pressure on the Confederate capital at Richmond, were also part of the Northern strategy. Jefferson Davis's, who's president of the Confederate States, had a defensive strategy which took advantage of fighting on familiar territory, as well as keeping his army close to the basis of supply. The South was prepared to go on the offensive in the future when necessary, and move into the North through Maryland and Pennsylvania if the opportunities presented themselves. So let's talk about the war in the East. The first major engagement of the war was a disaster for the North. At the First Battle of Bull Run in Virginia, some 30,000 Union troops were routed, or they're turned around. They're stopped by a smaller Confederate force, as politicians and their families from Washington were watching. They were taking a picnic on the hills above the battlefield, and this was not an uncommon practice. People would, generally speaking, if there's a battle, they would go and sort of sit and watch. The defeat prompted Abraham Lincoln to put General George McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan spent the next 9 months training his men to become very disciplined soldiers, but then he seemed reluctant to let them fight. He doesn't utilize them to the fullest extent. Their army suffered another defeat when it finally did go into the field during what's called the Peninsula Campaign, which was an attempt to take Richmond by sea. In September, the South went on the offensive. The Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee moved into Maryland, and they met the Union troops at the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam, it was the bloodiest confrontation of the war, and ultimately there was no decisive victory. It was inconclusive. But Lee retreated, and because of his retreat, McClellan claimed the victory at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam was significant not just because of the lives lost, but because the outcome finally gave Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which probably ended any chance that the South had of getting Great Britain and France to intervene. Also significant was Lincoln's dismissal of General McClellan, because when Lee retreated, McClellan refused to pursue. So Abraham Lincoln and McClellan ultimately became very much bitter political rivals. Lincoln first replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside's doubts about his own ability to lead a large army proved correct. He lost a major battle against Lee and Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson at Fredericksburg. The president then turned to General Hooker, also known as Fighting Joe Hooker. Despite Hooker's overwhelming numerical superiority on the battlefield, he had a lot more people, right? He was unable to prevent a major Confederate victory at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. So I apologize, I did not have that on the slide. Now we're moving to the War in the West. The War in the West. The Union Army had a greater success in the West. After driving Confederate forces out of Kentucky, Ulysses S. Grant moved into Tennessee, where he very narrowly averted defeat at Shiloh. And then he proceeded to the Mississippi River, where he captured Memphis. Grant's troops moved downriver to lay siege to a very important river town in Mississippi known as Vicksburg. Vicksburg was able to hold out until July 1863, so this was a little less than a year that they were able to hold out. So, wow, that's pretty significant. The Navy under Admiral David Farragut played an important role in the Western campaign because he took New Orleans and then Baton Rouge in May of 1862. During the siege of Vicksburg, however, fighting in the West became a stalemate. So the city of New Orleans is a very interesting place, as we all know and love or hate. It really is a place that you have to love or you hate. The Union officer that's in command of the city of New Orleans is Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler, who earned the nickname the Beast. The Beast. So Benjamin Beast Butler upsets both the Crescent City as well as the North. You see, there were some ladies in New Orleans, and these would have been high-standing ladies, okay? So, like, not necessarily all of them would have been incredibly rich, but they all had a higher class to them. These are not super poor women, okay? So, New Orleans, let's say middle and upper class ladies are showing contempt for Union soldiers. And Benjamin Butler says, oh no, we are not going to have any of that. So he tells the Union soldiers to treat the ladies, if and when they show contempt to the Union soldiers, to treat them as prostitutes. So they jail them. I mean, they just treat them really badly, and this absolutely just goes against everything Southern. You don't treat your women that way, right? Especially not high-born ladies of class. You just don't do that. So, word of this gets back to Washington, D.C., and the North is very, very unhappy with Benjamin Butler, and so they recall Butler and make him come back, and the control of the city is given to another. So that's a fun piece of Louisiana history there for you, Benjamin Beast Butler. But we also, once again, Admiral Farragut has had some successes on the Mississippi River. But these are not the only significant naval engagements of the war. The Confederates salvaged the Merrimack, which was a scuttled Union warship, and scuttled means it wasn't used anymore. And they reinforced it with iron and renamed it the Virginia. So the Virginia, it's coated in iron now. It's ironclad. It sails to Hampton Roads, where it sank several wooden-sided Union ships on blockade duty. The North, seeing how their cannonballs were bouncing off their iron sides, right? They're not making penetration whatsoever. They hastily built their own ironclad ship called the Monitor. There was one person who looked at this vessel and said it just looked odd. It looked like a cheese box on a raft. So the Monitor and the Virginia clashed on March 9th, 1862. Neither ship could sink the other. So the lesson was pretty much clear. Future navies would turn to steam-powered and ironclad battleships. There definitely is some uh, confusion if whether or not Britain and France are actually going to help. The South recognized early that support from other countries could very well be decisive in determining the outcome of the war. In Great Britain, public opinion was divided. Merchants and mill owners backed the Confederacy because the South was the major supplier of cotton for British textile mills. But there was also widespread opposition to slavery and to the slave trade. By this time, William Wilberforce had already passed away, but he was able to get the slave trade ended in Great Britain. So they are very much against slavery and the slave trade, sort of generally speaking. Early in the war, relations between the U.S. and Great Britain soured over what was known as the Trent Affair. The British steamer, that's a boat, called the Trent, was stopped by the U.S. Navy, and two Confederate diplomats en route to England, they were seeking recognition for the South. They were taken off by Union troops, or by the Union sailors on board the Trent. When the British demanded the Confederates' release on grounds of diplomatic immunity, Lincoln ordered them set free. So he is kind of doing what is being asked of him. The British, as well as the French, built ships for the South. The most notoriously destructive of which was the British-built Alabama. But U.S. threats of war forced both countries to back off. Although the foreign-built ships were helpful to the Confederacy, they really didn't alter the outcome of the war. France took advantage of the U.S. Civil War to pursue its own agenda in the Western Hemisphere. They used what they alleged as unpaid debts as a pretext for intervention. And French troops invaded Mexico in 1863, installing Maximilian of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico. The United States could do nothing about this very blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine during the war, but it did come to the aid of Mexico's legitimate president, Benito Juarez, by moving 50,000 troops to the border after the U.S. Civil War was over. France would eventually withdraw its forces, and Maximilian ended up in front of a firing squad. So France pretty much just stayed in Mexico. They really did nothing to help the Confederates. Although the majority of soldiers on both sides during the Civil War were volunteers, the Confederacy and the Union both resorted to the draft as fighting expanded. So conscription of men between the ages of 18 and 35 for a 3-year period became law in the South as early as 1862. Planters with 20 or more slaves and men employed in what were considered to be essential civilian jobs were exempt from the draft. Military service could also be avoided by finding a substitute, so getting someone to fight in your stead, or simply paying $500 to the government. The draft in the North was instituted about a year later, about a year after the South, for men between the ages of 20 and 45, and it too included provisions for substitution and payment, $300 instead of the $500 in the South. In July 1863, in New York City, mobs made up largely of Irish immigrants rioted against the Union conscription law, and they took out their anger on African Americans, whom they blamed for the war. The exemptions and the ability of the wealthy to buy their way out of service caused dissension. And troops began to see the conflict as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. So The percentage of draftees in the Confederate troops was considerably higher than the percentage in the Union Army. So, in talking about the hot issue of the war, slavery. Early in the war, to keep the border states in the Union, Lincoln resisted the demands of radical Republicans to immediately emancipate the slaves. Military commanders, though, sometimes took action counter to Lincoln's policy during actual fighting. So, for example, faced with slaves who had run away to Union lines, General Benjamin Butler treated them as contraband and did not return them to their owners. This is very much in the first part of the war. Then we have General John C. Fremont in charge of the Department of the West, which included Missouri and Kansas. He confiscated the property of rebels and declared that their slaves were emancipated. Lincoln very quickly and effectively countermanded Fremont's order, and Congress, meanwhile, started to enact measures that whittled away at slavery. We have the Confiscation Act of 1861, which allowed captured or runaway slaves who had been in use by the Confederacy to support the Union effort instead. In 1862, slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia with compensation to their owners. And it was, and the same thing happened in the territories in June of 1862. The Second Confiscation Act gave real freedom to slaves belonging to anyone actively participating in the war against the Union. With the Emancipation Proclamation, there's a lot of things that people generally don't know about the Emancipation Proclamation. Despite Lincoln's support for gradual manumission of the slaves, Lincoln soon realized that immediate action was necessary, both on military and moral grounds. Enslaved peoples were an asset to the Confederate war effort. And public opinion in the North was very rapidly shifting in favor of emancipation. Following the Union, quote-unquote victory at Antietam, the president issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which granted freedom to all slaves in the Confederate States and in other areas of active rebellion as of January 1, 1863. The proclamation did not apply to the slave-holding border states, so the border states in between the North and the South, nor would it apply to any Confederate states that rejoined the Union before the deadline. The formal Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, specifically delineated the Confederate territory where slaves were freed, urged the enslaved peoples not to resort to violence except in self-defense. And it confirmed that African Americans could serve in the Union Army and the Navy. So despite its limited scope, the Emancipation Proclamation redefined the purpose of the war. Southerners as well as Northerners recognized this fact, and they condemned Northerners with Southern sympathies condemned Lincoln's actions as equivalent to promoting a slave insurrection throughout the Confederacy. The slaves themselves responded with jubilation, of course, not rebellion, and those who could ran to the Union lines where their symbolic freedom could become a reality. Almost 200,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War, the majority of them being former slaves. They were organized into segregated units under white officers. They received less pay than white soldiers until Congress changed that in June of 1864. At first, black troops were used only for menial jobs behind the lines. So, cooks and taking care of horses and things of that nature. But when they were finally allowed into combat, they distinguished themselves and definitely earned respect for their courage under fire. Black soldiers knew very well that they faced a very quick execution or re-enslavement if they were captured. So that definitely encouraged almost a laugh at the face of danger. I'm gonna throw myself into everything with all that I've got, and if I die, I die. They had much more to lose than others did. Around 37,000 African Americans were killed during the war, and this number definitely represents a significantly higher casualty rate than that of white soldiers. So I know that this was very, very quick, but once again, we have a lot of things going on. Got to cover a lot of ground. So, with about half the number of troops as the Army of the Potomac, General Lee was unable to break the siege at Petersburg. He broke off the engagement and tried to swing west as well as south to link up with what was left of his troops in North Carolina. Jefferson Davis abandoned Richmond and was eventually captured in Georgia in May of 1864. With the Confederate capital in Union hands, General Lee found himself pinned in by Grant's troops and those of General Philip Sheridan, and he asked for surrender terms on April 7th, 1865. The formal surrender took place 2 days later in the town of Appomattox. In the meantime, Sherman's army was moving into North Carolina to confront another Confederate general, General Johnston. Although Davis urged the general to fight on, Johnston surrendered his 37,000 men on April 26th. By the end of May, pretty much all Confederate resistance throughout the South had come to an end. President Lincoln, who had been reelected, really did not live to see the end of the war. He was assassinated by an actor named John Wilkes Booth while watching a play in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14th, 1865. So, although we have seen the South, or he got to see the South surrender, there really were still pockets of resistance, and he wasn't able to see all of that come to an end. Between 1861 and 1865, nearly 3 million men served in the Union and Confederate armies. More than 600,000 were killed, and an additional 275,000 were seriously wounded. Civil War casualties were almost as many as the combined losses in all other American wars through the Vietnam War. Although the fighting ended in the spring of 1865, the sectional divisions that led to the Civil War continued to fester for generations. The immediate question, though, was how the defeated states of the Confederacy would be treated. Although Lincoln had sounded a conciliatory note, so meaning like he's saying, let's extend the hand of friendship, in his second inaugural address, just a few days before his assassination, many others felt that the South needed to pay dearly for the war. So this concludes the Civil War lecture, and we will pick up again with Reconstruction.